In this video, we're going to talk about how to solve quadratic equations using square roots. And we're looking for quadratic equations that are in this form: ax squared plus c is equal to 0. When we look at these in the beginning, we start with something like x squared equals 16. And we can think, what squared gives us 16? Well, we know 4 squared is 16. We also know that negative 4 squared is 16. So x could be 4, or it could be negative 4. Both of those answers work. Sometimes you'll see it written once, like this, plus or minus 4, so that it's just a little bit of shorthand. So for the second one, x squared equals 49, what can we square and get 49? Well, we could square 7. That would give us 49, but we can also square negative 7. So we have these kind of basic problems where we know what number squared gives us that result. Now, when we get to things like x squared equals 75, we're not quite as sure exactly what that number is going to be because 75 is not a perfect square. So when we get to problems like this, we want to show a little bit more of what we're doing in this process. When we have x squared equals 75, if we want to know what squared equals 75, what we need to do is take the square root of 75. So we've learned that anytime we do something to one side, we need to do it to the other. So we're going to take the square root of both sides. And in order to be sure that we get both answers, we're going to put that plus or minus out in front so we get the positive and the negative result. The square root of x squared is x. And then we've got our plus or minus. Let's simplify that square root of 75. We know that 25 is a factor of 75, so we could say it's the square root of 25 times the square root of 3. So x equals plus or minus 5 times the square root of 3. Now it may be that what you want is a decimal value instead of a simplified radical. So this answer works fine, but it's also okay for us to go to our calculator and just type in what's the square root, so second square root of 75. We get this lovely decimal. Let's round to the hundredths place. Be sure that when you're working problems that you look to see what you're asked to round to. So we're going to say this is about 8.66, and we have the positive value and the negative value. So x is equal to plus or minus 8.66. We'll do the same thing here. X squared equals 8. So we're going to go ahead and take the square root of both sides. Don't forget that plus or minus, so we get both of our answers. The square root of x squared is x equals plus or minus. If we simplify the radical, we get 2 times the square root of 2. Or if we do it on our calculator, the square root of 8 is roughly 83. So plus or minus 2.83. Now when we get into problems like these, we notice that this looks a little bit different than the problems that we were doing. And how does it look different? Well, you might notice that it has a minus 27. You might notice that the x squared is being multiplied times 3. So our goal on these problems is to make it look like those ones that were much more basic. Get that x squared by itself. So let's see, let's start by adding 27 to both sides. And we get 3x squared equals 27. We can divide by 3, and we get x squared equals 9. That's much nicer. Now we can take the square root of both sides. Don't forget we get 2 answers, so x is equal to 3 and negative 3. Or we can write it plus or minus 3. This next one we look at, if we want to get x squared by itself, we would add 10 to both sides. So we get x squared is equal to 0. What's the only thing we can square and get 0? And that is 0. So for this one, we only have one solution. We just have x is equal to 0. Here's some more problems that you can use to practice. I do want to talk just about number 12. When we try to solve this, we want to get that x squared by itself. In the process, we end up saying x squared is equal to negative 2. But that means that x times itself is equal to a negative number. Well, we know that negative times negative is positive. And we know that positive times positive is positive. So there's not a real number that we can plug in for x that when we multiply it times itself, we get a negative. So since this doesn't work, we're going to say that there is no real solution. The reason we say that is because there is a solution when we look at the complex set of numbers, but that's not where we are right now. So we're going to say there's no real solution. Now when we look at ones like this, it's a little bit different. It looks kind of like something that's in vertex form since we have those parentheses, but we still have something squared equals something else. So when we have something squared, x minus 1 squared equals 25, we can solve that by taking the square root of both sides. The square root of anything squared is that number itself. So the square root of x minus 1 squared is x minus 1. The square root of 25 is 5. So I'm going to write down my 5 and my negative 5. Now you'll notice this time that x is not alone yet, so we have to do a little bit more work, and that is that we need to add 1 to both sides. But over here on the right side, there were 2 numbers. We're just going to add 1 to both of them. So we get x is equal to 6 and negative 4. You'll notice that our answers are no longer opposites, and that's okay. They don't have to be opposites. On this next one, x plus 2 squared equals 36. When we take the square root of both sides, we get x plus 2 equals positive 6 and negative 6. We'll subtract 2 from each piece. So we get x equals positive 4 and negative 8. Both of those numbers, if we plug them back into that original problem, the square root of x plus 2, oops, not the square root, that wasn't the original problem. X plus 2 squared equals 36. We can check by plugging in. Let's try the negative 8. Negative 8 plus 2 squared. That gives us negative 6 squared, which is 36. So that's true. That is a solution for our equation. We may have ones like these where there's a little bit more going on. You'll notice in this first one that x plus 7 squared equals 0. Well, the only thing we can square and get 0 is 0. So x plus 7 has to equal 0. We get the same thing if we take the square root of both sides. Then to finish solving, we would subtract the 7, so we get x equals negative 7. On 5, you'll notice that there's that 4 out in front, and it might be tempting to distribute the 4, but because we have a squared sign on the outside of the parentheses, we cannot distribute the 4. The only thing we can do to get rid of the 4 is divide both sides by 4. You may want to make it a decimal, but for many of these problems, it's going to be easier to leave it as a fraction. And the reason is, when we take the square root, you'll notice that both the 9 and the 4 are perfect squares. So it doesn't take a lot of work for us to get to the square root of 9/4 being 3/2 and negative 3/2. If we'd made it a decimal, it would have been 2.25. And we would have needed to take the square root of that, which we can certainly do. It's just going to take us a little bit more work. Now we add 3 to each of those answers that we got, and we get x equals 1.5 plus 3 is 4.5, or 4.5. Negative 1.5 plus 3 is positive 1.5. We can write those as decimals, as fractions, as mixed numbers, whichever we want. We would do this last one the same way, but you'll notice that after you subtract the 1 from both sides, you're then going to need to divide by 2. But you would still start by taking the square root of both sides and getting that this is equal to 6 and negative 6, and you would work on from there. Let's skip over some of these. These are great practice problems. You can stop and work those. Here's a word problem we see. We're talking about a touch tank, like one of those where you would get to pet stingrays. And they give you that the volume of that tank is 270 feet. Well, I would start by noticing or remembering that the volume is going to be the length times the width times the height. So we know that the volume is, let's write that down over here too, length times width times height. We know that the volume is 270. And we know that the height is 3. So we need something for the length and the width. When we come into the problem, it says its length is 3 times its width. We don't know either one of those. So we're going to say W for the width, and if the length is 3 times that, the length is 3W. So this is W, this is 3, and this is W. So we're going to plug in a 3W for the length and a W for the width. Now we probably want to simplify the right-hand side. 3W times W is 3W squared, times 3 is 9W squared. And when we get to this point, it looks just like the other problems we've been working, where we're isolating what is squared, and then taking the square root of both sides. And we get W is about 5.5. When we take the square root on our calculator, second square root of 30, we get 5.5 when we round. Now be careful, because now they also want to know the length, and the length is 3 times that. You don't want to round to 5.5 and multiply the 5.5 times 3. You want to multiply this unrounded answer by 3. So this times 3 is 16.4. If you'd done 5.5 times 3, you would get 16.5. So this answer is a more exact answer. That's the one you want to go with. So the width is 5.5 and the length is 16.4. Both of these are in feet. That's it for 4.3.